Welcome to America's Heroes Group.
Welcome back to America's Heroes Group. This time we have a powerful roundtable community outreach section. Today, Saturday, December 17, 2022. December's AIDS Awareness and National Human Rights Month. Our host is Kelley. I'm Sean Claiborne, the co-host. Our executive producer is Glenda Smith. Our digital media producer is Ivan Ortega of Scouts Honor Productions. And we have a new panelist with us today, Richard Brookshire. He's a co-founder of the Black Veterans Project, a non-partisan 501c3 nonprofit elevating Black public education around the unique history of Black veterans in the United States. And also a brief background on Richard Brookshire. He was the Director of Communications for Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America and the Deputy Director for Communications Politics at the Human Rights Campaign. He is an alumnus of Morehouse College and Fordham University and holds a Master's of Public Administration in Urban and Social Policy from Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. He served as an Army Infantry combat medic in the wars in Afghanistan, and he has been highlighted in the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, The Grill, and other publications. Welcome to the broadcast. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing good. I'm happy to be here.
Great to have you. So tell us about Black Veterans Project. What's the mission, purpose? What's the agenda of what you're trying to accomplish? And kind of break it down so people can understand there's a lot of stuff going on with this. And it goes into a lot of different areas about
for sure. When we started about 4 years ago, there was a dearth of real digital storytelling around the unique historical barriers that Black veterans had faced around racial discrimination, around the history of bad paper discharges, and there wasn't a lot of reporting about the state of race in the military now. And so what we've tried to do is elevate that conversation, working in tandem with a lot of researchers. Our main partnership has been with Yale Law School. So, I mean, there's a lot. We have done a lot in 4 years. But at the heartbeat of the project, it's research oriented, and it's about activating that research to advance policies. And at the heartbeat of the project is really kind of redress oriented, reparations oriented, right? Like, how can we potentially kind of aggregate all this research, see if we can get some new data points, and then try to drive home up a policy agenda and some kind of litigation that might, create a pathway or mechanism for Black vets who've been racially discriminated against by the VA to get some level of real redress. Because we know the historical record, right? Like, I think in the Black veteran community, it's widely known. It's almost commonplace that we know that just racial discrimination is a fact of our existence. But there hadn't been, a real robust effort in recent years to try to figure out how to bring all that together and really leverage digital tools, really the internet as an organizing tool to try to bring some pressure to bear and see if we can actually get some redress done. So that's been at the heartbeat of the work.
So take us into some more details about some of that, some of the discrimination and also the history and the treatment of African Americans and even Native Americans as well, and people of brown and black skin color. So we have something coming up, the GI Bill Restoration Act. So using that as a starting point, kind of take us back into the history and some of the inequities and some of the disparities of how people of color have been treated in the military versus what the mainstream population was able to receive from the benefits of being in uniform.
Yeah, so, taking a look at the GI Bill Restoration Act, this kind of landmark legislation that was introduced, it has not been passed, earlier in the 117th Congress, so about a year and a half ago now, by Senator Warnock, Congressman Claiborne, and Congressman Moulton. And what they were trying to do is basically send out a message that there needs to be something done about the fact that Black veterans were largely locked out of the GI Bill, especially at the advent of its inception after World War II. So kind of circling back, the original GI Bill became law in 1944. It was a landmark kind of social policy that, for the first time, really afforded working class men who served in the military and women access to zero VA back home loans and education benefits. But because of a national kind of network of Jim Crow laws, and it didn't just exist in the South, it very much existed and was codified in different ways in the North through redlining, racial covenants, and racially discriminatory practices and collegiate admissions. Black vets were largely locked out of it. So the statistics vary. It's been actually really difficult to pin down exactly how many Black vets actually got access to it. But we know that they were diminutive based off of studies like Mississippi, where I think over the course of 1945 to 1956, less than 5% of Black veterans who lived in Mississippi were able to access their GI Bill, or states like New York, right? Like when you had, years would go by and one or two or three Black veterans would be able to secure a home loan. And then, for the most part, Black vets weren't able to really utilize their education benefits. I think a lot of people assume that, Black vets just went to HBCUs, but HBCUs looked a lot different in the past, right? They were smaller and they couldn't absorb the million or more Black troops that actually were returning. And so, small numbers of Black vets actually ended up going to HBCUs. And that really created the seeds of an economic chasm that we still see today. There was a recent study by Brandeis University that showed that for every Black veteran that in World War II that didn't get access to their benefit, their family is owed about $180,000 in benefits that white families got full access to. And it created the modern American middle class. And a lot of people don't really understand or don't really kind of compute that history. And a lot of our project is to try to lay that fundamental understanding down for folks. And then kind of, going forward, as you look into Vietnam and the Gulf War, and even today, bad paper discharges have been like a huge mechanism that has locked countless Black vets out of tens of billions of dollars of economic welfare that they would have been otherwise afforded had they had full access to the myriad of benefits that you can get as a veteran. And so there's a need to reckon with that history in a real way, and then to bring new research to bear. So we were able to help support a recent study that showed even over the last 5 years, it was a study by the Connecticut Veterans Legal Center, and it showed that from 2015 to 2020, Black service members even today are 1.5 to 2.3, depending on the branch of service, but almost twice as likely to get out of the military and not have access to their benefits. So the history is still continuing, and there's a real need to address it.
So what do you think is the problem today as far as African Americans and people of color accessing the benefits? I had a conversation. This is interesting because I had a conversation about this twice, actually. We did it once in a show last week. We had Stephanie Collada, who founded the Veterans Legislative Voice, and we talked about this as well. We talked about the GI Bill Restoration Act and Senator Warnock's participation in it. And we also talked about the history of the fact that, people that came back from World War II, everybody is assumed in our own minds in history, we think, you're a veteran. People don't realize that blacks and whites served in segregated units in World War II. That originally in the military, African Americans weren't even allowed to really take on all the jobs that were offered to everybody else in the military. So African Americans had to be servants, laborers, cooks, guys to clean everything up on the ship or whatever, if you're in the Navy, or doing all the labor work in the battlefield and in World War II. And coming home and watching people that were prisoners of war, people that they were fighting against, getting better treatment than they were getting. People coming home on transportation or being flown home by the military back to their communities, and they're watching, former Nazis fly first class, and they're in, the back of the plane. If they get on the plane, they probably stick them on the back of the bus. You know what I'm saying? Seeing that reality, and then being told, okay, well, you got the GI Bill, but nobody's taking your GI Bill. Nobody's going to allow you to use a GI Bill. And then you touched on that really important point of the fact that, so imagine what the world would look like, what this country would look like if over 1 million people who served in World War II, if they were able to participate in the GI Bill, if they came back and brought those dollars you mentioned to black colleges. Because there was segregation still, in 1945, there was still plenty of segregation going around. So a lot of them wouldn't have been able to go to, traditional mainstream universities. Some people call them white universities. I just call them mainstream universities because really they're very diverse when you look at the real population. Huge Asian communities in major universities, of course. It's no surprise if you've been to any major university, you'll see a large Asian community as well. But when you go and look at what African Americans were afforded to participate in at that time, and even from decades later, all that money would have flowed into these HBCUs, historically black colleges, and they would have built up these universities, and they would be different institutions today if they had those millions and millions of dollars invested in those institutions. and then breeding a whole nother generation of thought leaders that would have came from the military. We just talked about this with the University of Chicago. We just had Dr. Troy Odom who's talked about this, had this same conversation of things we're doing today with, Skill Bridge, which is a program that taking service members and training them to transition and to do things, great things, and to contribute and build up communities around the country. So you're taking that away from African Americans and the history of the development of this country and our neighborhoods.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you surmised it well, right? And I think that there's been different levers that have kind of been pulled at different times in history to lock Black vets out of these quintessential veterans benefits that you get if you serve, which are education, housing, healthcare, and that's really where we made some strides, right? Really trying to get more data around health. Disability compensation disparities. So for 2 years at the beginning of the project, we partnered with Yale and we said, hey, we want to get our hands on data. We know that data is really the starting point for any kind of legislative redress and any kind of litigation that we might, try to try our hand at. And so we did a quite large, one of the largest data pools around racial disparities in VA's history, looking at 20 years of data relating to disability compensation. And we were able to show that for 2 decades, from 2000 to basically the present day, there has been statistically significant differences in the rate of denials that Black vets have faced for disability compensation. And one of the most alarming ones that we were able to show that was from 2015 to more recent data showed that Black veterans were almost 30% more likely to get denied for PTSD compensation. And so when you intersect that and the fact that we're twice as likely to be as homeless, face higher joblessness rates, and often return to resource poor communities and aren't well educated about accessing our benefits in general, it is, I think, the final piece of the puzzle to really paint a very clear historical narrative, right? And so we took that data and we basically said, hey, from what the VA said in court over the course of a year and a half of litigating the FOIA request was that they didn't even study racial disparities for 20 years. So they knew that they were coming out of a long legacy of racial discrimination affecting veterans' access. And for 20 years, the VA didn't even study the issue. And so we're basically using that along with the statistically significant difference in disability compensation, along with all the other history we talked about, right? The obstruction around GI Bill, the proliferation of bad paper discharges, and we've tried to use one case to paint a very specific argument. So let me walk y'all through that case. So there's a gentleman by the name of Conley Monk, and as I continue to talk with y'all, I'm going to try to bring him on the show and have a conversation so your audience can get to know him. Conley was a Vietnam War veteran. And I like to start his story by the fact that his father was a World War II veteran who came back, served honorably, and never accessed the GI Bill. So Conley comes in, a generation later, growing up in New Haven, joins to go fight as a Marine in Vietnam, serves honorably, but after his first tour, gets into an altercation with a superior who calls him a racial epithet. They get into a physical altercation, and I know a lot of Vietnam vets can relate to that. And he ended up getting kicked out. And he had a dishonorable discharge, but he didn't know how dishonorable discharge would affect him. He was working for the VA before he was working at the VA before he had even joined the Marines. So when he got back to his community in New Haven, they wouldn't even give him his job back. And he struggled for over 40 years to get access to his benefits. And then despite that, and despite, dealing with, all untold, undiagnosed and untreated PTSD, he had to put himself through school. He wasn't able to buy a home, for his family with this GI Bill, and really, really struggled. But he started working with Yale in the early 90s, and he was also, big in the community and really trying to support and try to help other vets get access to their benefits, all while he didn't have access to his. And he started working with Yale in the early 90s. In 2015, he finally won a case, and it was a landmark case. And it was a landmark case because it essentially, for the first time, gave people who had been diagnosed with PTSD or a traumatic brain injury who did not have access to their veterans benefits because they didn't have an honorable discharge. Because of Conley's win in 2015, they could now apply and would likely get access to their benefits if they've been diagnosed with PTSD. And he was able to win a 3-year settlement, basically going 3 years of back pay for the money that the VA owed him, which was about $150,000. And because of that, was able to buy a beautiful home for his family that I was able to go and visit earlier this year. But he's suing because not only because he didn't know that the VA was discriminating against him, and our data basically proves that they understood and they knew that there was an issue and did nothing to address it. They're by default being grossly negligent and wanting to actually address why racial disparities were so rampant. And he's basically suing for all the back pay and the damages done to him because he should have had access to his benefits since 1971. He should have had access to disability compensation for 100% PTSD, which he does now have. He should have had access to zero VA back home loan. He should have had access to education benefits. He didn't have access to that, so he's suing for $1 million in damages. And then he's also suing on behalf of his deceased father because it's intergenerational for so many vets, for so many black vets, and minority vets. So this applies to Latino and Native American vets as well. But my focus has been on black vets. And his father didn't get access to the GI Bill, and he's suing on behalf of that. And at the end of the day, it's really it's never really been done for. Like, this lawsuit is historic in many ways, because not only are we bringing new data to the table to actually file the suit, but we're suing it under the FTCA, saying that the VA has been grossly negligent. And we don't know what's going to happen, right? We're hoping that at the very least, VA comes to the table and actually admits the wrongs that it's done to black vets and wants to move forward with some kind of recompense, right? Because you can't talk about equity and inclusion and all these other types of things and not really reckon with the damage that you've done to the black community. And we're talking about tens of billions of dollars siphoned out of the black community because black vets weren't getting full and equal access to their benefits. So, yeah.
And I my bones, I feel that the military will make the right decision at some point. I think we're getting a lot more wiser, although there is still a lot of conservative voices out there, ultra conservative voices out there that lump everything into woke consciousness and all kind of weird stuff, whatever like that. The really woke consciousness is just a reinvented hip hop version of black consciousness that came out of the 60s and 70s and been around forever. But all this stuff gets distorted in media and gets distorted. And at least in the arguments pro and con and partisanship and things like that, people joining, sticking with their team, whether they're liberal, conservative, whatever. Put all that stuff to the side and let's look at what's right and what's wrong. Looking at the real data, looking at the information, getting the information, the data is so critical. I'm so proud of what you guys are doing because of the fact that you are data focused, as opposed to saying, well, this is where we think it ought to be because this is what we think it ought to be. No, just looking at what is the facts. What are the facts?
Let's look at the facts. Exactly. Absolutely.
And what is
and we want to reckon with that. We want to reckon with the history, and we want transparency, right? So one of the things that we might, be able to come out of the lawsuit, and Senator Blumenthal was able to. He sits on both the House Armed Services and the House Veteran Affairs Committees, the Senate Veteran Affairs Committee, and the Senate Armed Services. Apologies, but he was at the press conference for Connolly's suit, and he said that it was, indeed a very historic because he is very hopeful that this will actually inspire some type of hearing where we actually get to discuss, and VA has to come to the table with what it knows and how long it's known it and all of the facts, right? Because I think that that's what the historical record owes. But I said that I got the opportunity, and I want before we wrap our conversation today, I wanted the opportunity to talk about the bill, this essentially an iteration of the GI Bill Restoration Act. We had a conversation about it. I got the opportunity to testify on the last hearing of the House Veteran Affairs Committee this past week, actually, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But hold on, I lost my train of thought. There's so much information to talk about.
The GI Bill Restoration Act. So Senator Warnock was working with that, and then now he's back in office. He got reelected. Yeah. And so what are the details of this, and then what will it do to help veterans?
So let's start with the fact that we're in a really, not want to say odd, because we've always faced a lot of challenges as Black folk in this country, but we're at an odd time in our country's politics, specifically with the Supreme Court, right? They're really on the verge of potentially knocking down affirmative action and all these types of things, right? So trying to pass some kind of targeted redress bill is actually really hard, right? Not impossible, but difficult, and you have to build the political will for it. And one of the things that and I'll give some pats on the back to myself and my team is we've been able to really leverage the media and get this conversation, exposure in the media that then kind of forces, in some respects, congressional leaders to respond, right, and in kind. And because there wasn't really any movement on the GI Bill Restoration Act. I mean, as soon as it got, to Congress, it's kind of almost dead in the water. And not because it wasn't good policy, but because of the fact that we have this landscape that we're having to contend with, which is we might pass some targeted-based racial redress for black vets that then gets knocked down by the Supreme Court, and then nothing ends up passing. That and then the size of the bill, like it's gone anywhere between $30 to $80 billion to potentially give all the direct descendants of Black World War II veterans access to zero VA back home loans and education benefits. I personally think it should be done. We gave $70 billion to Ukraine in a year. It's not something that our country can afford. It's just a choice, right, that we're making. But I'll rewind this back. So there was someone by the name of Marcia Spotzer who wrote this really brilliant piece of potential legislation. It's only in draft form right now, and that's what we were discussing at the most recent hearing of the House Veteran Affairs Committee. And this bill is important because it would look to give the descendants of World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam veterans, no matter what color they were, if they didn't use their benefit, then they can pass it down to their descendants. That's what the bill is basically saying. And now there's some stipulations, and it's explicitly looking at the VA home loan, right? Mm-hmm. Which is important because you think about the building of generational wealth, the ability to be able to buy a home without any money down is really actually important, right? Because trying to put money down on a home is the biggest barrier for most people to buy a house right now, right?
Exactly right.
But long story short, this bill is essentially facially neutral, which basically means it's not race specific. It just so happens that the majority of people that would benefit from this bill happen to be black descendants because they were the ones that their forefathers weren't able to actually use the benefit, so they would be able to pass it down. Now, they want to put some stipulations on it, like they want to make it so that only first-time home buyers could potentially use it in order to kind of whittle down the number. But at this particular point, the way that the bill is written, about somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million descendants would tentatively have access to the zero VA back home loan. Listen, redress is complicated. Reparations is a complicated project, right? Like, it's easy to talk about in broad strokes, but when you get down to the nitty-gritty and trying to make redress policy, you come up against some real challenges. But this bill is a starting point, right? Trying to think about how can we actually get something passed in Congress that would redress this really significant racial harm, right? It's really significant that has impacted and continues to impact families, really. Because when you talk about black veterans, you're talking about their families, right? Who weren't able to buy a home, or if they did, they struggled to, right? Because they didn't have access to this really crucial benefit. So I'm optimistic about the bill. There seems to be a desire to want to move forward with it in the 118th Congress, but we're going to have a Republican House, so we might have to wait another 2 years, right? So there's still a lot of groundwork that needs to happen. And where we're really wanting to focus our attention as a project really is beginning to storytell, right? Like, we've been able to really leverage research, but now it's about, like, there are millions of stories out there, and we need to kind of bring them to a space and make it digestible to the public so we can build the political case to make this happen, and other types of redress, because we're really scratching the surface of what redress can actually look like right now, right? Relative to veterans not being able to get access to their benefits. And the last thing, and there hasn't actually been any kind of legislative movement, but a lot of legislators have kind of hinted at wanting to address the proliferation of bad paper discharges and wanting to figure out some kind of mechanism that can make it easier for black vets who've been historically locked out of their benefits to get access to their benefits, right? And potentially see how their descendants might be able to benefit as well. So that is something I'm really hopeful about, but continue to have conversations and bring brilliant other minds to the table, because I'm sure these are not new ideas, right? I think black vets have been wanting to see things like this happen for a very long time. But the thing that's allowing us to be able to be effective is we have data that we've never had before, right? And we have the internet, so we're really able to leverage relationships with the press and build momentum in that way. So that's where we're at.
I appreciate your time, Richard Brookshire. That is really important information. You're the co-founder of Black Veterans Project, a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit elevating public education around the unique history of black veterans in the United States. And last time I checked, there's no statute of limitations on debt. You might be able to get it off your credit with a few tricks. But a debt owed is a debt owed.
We love to see it. Well, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.